The deadline has passed, and there is still no global climate agreement at the COP26 summit. We will take a look at significant steps made so far to fight climate change. Hello, I'm Halldór sitting in for Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. Well, it's not exactly something new. Going overtime has become routine at United Nations climate change conferences. The nearly 200 countries still could not reach a consensus on the agreement, and talks are ongoing. Earlier, hundreds of delegates staged a walkout over lack of action. CGTN's Nawied Jabarkhyl has more from Glasgow.
Friday was the planned deadline for this COP26 summit, as almost 200 countries look to agree on a way to protect the planet. In a bid to achieve that, an updated draft deal has softened the language around some of the key demands, especially on the use of coal and fossil fuels.
If it doesn't get across the line, it's only going to be because of a lack of political will, political determination and political leadership. And this generation of young people are watching. Let's not let them down.
Another important issue is who pays for climate change policies. Poorer countries want richer ones to offer them more help, as developed nations have historically contributed more to global emissions. The latest text calls for funding to be ramped up, but doesn't include an annual review of pledges. Many developing countries hope such a clause would put more pressure on donors.
12 years ago, rich countries made the pledge of $100 billion every year by 2020 for developing countries to tackle climate change. It still hasn't been met. This has greatly damaged political mutual trust. The success of COP26 will be hinged on whether the pledges can be met. Rich countries have yet to show their sincerity and commitment to honor their pledges.
Protesters, though, are demanding far more ambition and action. Around the city of Glasgow, a last-ditch effort to make their voices heard. For many climate activists, the international consensus being worked on here won't be enough to limit the impacts of global warming.
I don't think it's enough. I think we wanted more and we needed to see stronger action, but still has some bits that are important, like a call for countries to revise 2030 targets by next year. We think the text now is a floor. It's the absolute floor. We would like to see it improved, but still has some baby steps there.
This updated deal has made some vital concessions. It may be a matter of just a few words, but by giving countries more time to wean off fossil fuels, for example, or calling for a commitment to net zero by 2050, it's essentially hoping to ease any major concerns. In fact, this entire process has been a major balancing act, trying to incorporate different national needs, aspirations, political systems and economies, and getting them to agree on a common cause.
What comes out of Glasgow may be a feat of diplomacy at a time when the world seems fractured, but it may not be enough to meet that crucial 1.5-degree target. Nawied Jabarkhyl, CGTN, Glasgow.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel from Glasgow. Dr. George Carter is a research fellow and director of the Pacific Institute at the Australian National University. Joining us from Iceland, Halldór Jóhannsson is the executive director of the Arctic Porthole. And Qinhua is a professor of international political economy at Renmin University of China. She's joining us now from Beijing. George, let's start with you. You're there in Glasgow. Help us make sense of all of this. What are we seeing there? How disappointed are you that we're going into overtime? What have been the achievements? What are the sticking points?
Well, it wasn't unexpected, as this is tradition for COP, as the news article has mentioned, and we've been doing this over the years. When we come to the crucial years, such as in Paris and such as this year in Glasgow, where we're trying to finalize the rule, there will always be those sticky points, and negotiators and leaders have always anticipated it's either going to be an extra 24 hours or an extra 48 hours. The mood is still positive, constructive. There's still time which the president has given. It's now 11:04 p.m. in the evening here in Glasgow, but consultation is still continuing. So the president is, the UK presidency is still eager to hear from parties. I'm here as part of not only as a researcher, but supporting Pacific Island states and the Alliance of Small Island States. And there's a presidential consultation at 12:30 morning of Senate. So the consultation still continues. The state of play in the next 24 hours, we expect, as according to the presidency, a new text tomorrow at 8 a.m. He will then call for another informal at 10 a.m. to see the views of the parties. And he has again alluded to he would like to conclude tomorrow at 6 p.m. But there's, as we've now known, there's a smorgasbord, an array of diverse issues. It's not just coal, it's not just fossil fuels that's undecided. We still have carbon and carbon markets as part of the rule book that hasn't been finalized, climate financing, and the list goes on. And so that will continue throughout tonight and also throughout all day tomorrow.
Halldór, I know you were in Glasgow as well. There's really two stories that emerge at these events. We've got the inside people who haggle about everything, and we've got the outside people, these activists demanding action. We heard from one activist today. I want to play a little bit of it and get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen in.
The truth is that the atmosphere doesn't care about commitments. It only cares about what we put into it or stop putting into it. Humanity will not be saved by promises. It's hard to believe business and finance leaders when they haven't delivered before. They have not been faithful in their promises.
So you have these young people. I mean, Greta Thunberg comes to mind where she gave that speech, the blah, blah, blah speech. You know, we hear a lot of blah, 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 a lot of talk, little action. These people very angry. You've got the people on the inside, the outside. Talk to us about this dynamic.
Well, I actually marched with them on Saturday. It was really interesting, and I have to say I was quite surprised to see the diversity of the people taking part. It was not just the young people; it was all kinds of people, even myself. And of course, they were not all marching for climate change or other topics as well. But my sincere belief is we always have to educate. We have to try to increase the knowledge, and I think that's what Greta is trying to say, that we need to increase the knowledge so that we all can share the responsibility of tackling the future in a responsible way. In my opinion, the young leaders are those who will probably have to take the burden of what our generation has not managed to do. I'm not terribly surprised to see what's been happening in Glasgow over the last 2 weeks. We see it in similar fora, and I've seen it even at the Arctic Council, and it is disappointing, but at the same time, we have to realize that tackling climate change and making life good on Earth is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So I feel with them, and I feel for them, but at the same time, if we support them and help educate and increase the knowledge, I think we have a good generation to take on the responsibilities that we have somewhat failed to do.
Qinhua, let me ask you a similar question. We heard Sturgeon talking to Nawied Jabarkhyl and his story, and she said, young people are watching, let's not let them down. Are they going to walk away from this let down, do you think?
I totally agree with the scholars, his view and opinion. In my understanding, the young people has been taking the burden from our generation. But thing is that the only the action of their way, I don't think can make the things put forward. You know that my graduates 2 and 3, they now in Glasgow joining in the Chinese climate talking the group, and they are young people. They are really are doing the things. So they told me that the environment this time in Glasgow for every party trying to get agreement, the will is very strong. And those people, the young people, their performance in every climate change conference when I were attending before. And so this time, we know that people from all over the world, they showed the stronger will for battling the climate change compared the years before 2020. So it's a good news and signal. But second is how to take the real active and concrete action. It should be and very decisive and through the discussion among the leaders. That is why, just as you are saying, that the first and the biggest barrier from people to real pushing our decision in Copenhagen and Paris, I think, is the politics. That is what, when I was in the UN to be discussing the energy transition from fossil fuel to new and renewable, we all find which is the biggest barrier is the politics.
Let me just jump in there for just a second, because one of the big achievements, I guess, if you were to say that came out of Glasgow, is this commitment, China and the United States, to work together to reduce methane. John Kerry saying it is 80 times more destructive than CO2. Talk to us about that agreement. What can it achieve, and what kind of signal does that send to the other countries?
You ask me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But there is still a very difficult one is the sixth point, that is how to really safeguard the market, the system, and also to make the market, as the United States, they persist that to be transparent. I think that is the very largest gap between two countries. So, but the big breakthrough is this time towards the COP26. The United States and the Chinese both government, they all shared their view that they will be doing the deep cooperation together among the climate change issues.
George, let me ask you about another issue, of course, which is financing. It comes up every time. You've got the haves and the have-nots. The haves, obviously, the emitters. The have-nots, the ones who are really kind of taking it on the chin. This is also another sticking point. What do you make of this?
The reason why it's such a sticking point, as you pointed out, is because every single party or regional grouping that is participating in this conference have different reasons as to why. So for developing countries, which is united under the fact that they produce less, well, since 1992, are newly industrialized countries or countries who are slowly developing. So they need the opportunity to have their industries grow. Unlike developed countries or the Annex 1 countries under the Kyoto Protocol, they've had industries for the last 200 years and have been a major cause for the last 200 years. So these are sort of the two main arguments out there as to why developed countries need to pay up in terms of climate financing. And then you have smaller states like the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean Islands who say, hey, we are at the front line. We contribute less than 0.6% to the emissions. We are not at fault here. Yet, we need finance for adaptation. Then you have Africa saying, we're the most vulnerable in terms of poverty, in terms of the impacts of climate change, in terms of food security, in terms of our agriculture. We need financing. And so all these different sticking points, all these reasons and rationales come through. And the presidency has to find a way to cut across these disagreements. And so beyond just funding for adaptation, there's also countries saying we need to also look at funding for loss and damage, which is a very big sticking point. So what happens when countries or communities cannot adapt when sea level rise has taken over their land and their people have to migrate, which leads to cultural loss, economic loss? Who funds this? It shouldn't be just insurance. There's also countries, but also big corporations that have a responsibility to pay for this. So all these are factored in the current conversations, which is year after year. But why this is very important for 2020, this year, because it sets the rules for the next 10 years. And so that's why it's elevated at such a higher point.
You know, Halldór, I want to talk about one of the speeches that really grabbed everyone's attention. This was a speech, of course, the foreign minister of Tuvalu making a speech at the COP conference. He was standing in water to show how his low-lying Pacific island nation is really on the front line of climate change. And your country is as well. I know, and we're showing the pictures now of him giving this speech. It was very dramatic. Your prime minister in 2019 wrote an op-ed in the New York Times lamenting the loss of a glacier. It disappeared as a result of climate change. Talk to us about some of these countries, including yours, already seeing the devastating impacts of climate change.
Yeah, I've been living in the Arctic for almost most of my life. I'm born up here and I've been living here. So I've often been asked, do you sense the difference? And I can tell you, I learned to ski when I was confirmed. I was given a summer ski course in a ski area in the middle of our highlands. And then a few years ago, I took my children there, and there's absolutely no snow left. It's all gone, and the ski lifts, of course, are just standing on the gravel. Our glaciers are retreating very, very fast. And I had the pleasure of being in Glasgow now with a group of scientists for the Arctic Base Camp, and we launched the Arctic Risk Platform including to introduce some of the consequences of the diminishing glaciers. And you know, last summer was the first summer that it actually rained on the Greenland ice sheet. If the Greenland ice sheet would melt away, the sea level on the globe would rise 7 meters. Just imagine that. So, of course, it's unlikely to happen, at least in our lifetime, but it's a consequence that we can't ignore. So we have to look at it. And we see this very apparently in Iceland now with the changes in our climate, the extreme weather patterns that are happening, floods, mudslides, etc., high wind. And this is increasingly happening all over the world. We look at Siberia, permafrost thawing, the wildfires, etc., etc. A lot of those are components that we don't understand yet well enough. So it definitely tells us, and that's what the policymakers, of course, have been pointing at. We need to increase the knowledge. We need to know more what's happening. And then again, we have to be able to get that knowledge, not just to the policymakers, but to the public, so people understand that every little bit counts. Everything that we can do, it actually matters. Because a lot of the people on the ground think, well, we can't do it and just enjoy it while it lasts, but that's not how we can tackle the matter. Not at all.
And of course, you know, we're talking about Glasgow, but obviously you've got vast experience when it comes to the Arctic. You meet with a lot of the regional players. I mean, this has to be a level of concern among all of them. How do you get that message across in a place like Glasgow?
Well, it's not easy. We brought an iceberg down from Greenland, and it was interesting to see a 4-ton iceberg turn into a 1-ton clump in only a matter of 4 to 5 days. So you can just imagine when, even though in Glasgow it was between 10 and 12 Celsius, it wasn't that terribly warm, it still melted away extremely fast. And it tells us that every degree that goes above zero it's drastic. So how do we get it across? Well, it's a good question. I think that's one of the big issues right now, is how do we get scientific knowledge across to policymakers. And for one hand, I believe we need long-term funding. A lot of the projects that we've seen so far are very short-term. We need long-term outreach and monitoring so that we can actually prove what's going on. And I think that's easier also for the public and the policymakers to understand, because like I said before, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So we have to look at it long term. And that's what fears me a bit about the Glasgow discussions. They're too short term. A lot of it, at least in my view. I think we have to have some milestones. We have to have a roadmap that we can all agree on and we can work towards. Because as the other speakers have mentioned very correctly, we're so diverse in this universe that we have. I mean, we have different life standards, we have different backgrounds, different cultures, etc. So we need to be able to tackle it from very different angles.
I want to thank all.
When you look at my region in the Arctic, it's so diverse. It's incredible difference between some of the areas.
Right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Really appreciate it. Good discussion. Climate change, of course, is also causing economic issues. Earlier, Anand Naidoo spoke with 2018 Nobel Prize winner Paul Romer about this and started by asking him what would be the effects of extreme weather on the global economy. Let's listen.
The weather and things like fire have a direct negative effect on the economy. As we start to address the problem of climate change and put in place new energy systems that will supply energy without using so much carbon, we'll be undertaking some additional investment. That could serve as a short-run boost to the economy, frankly, to have more investment demand. I think the main message that we should convey to people is that this is a change which, if we do it gradually, need not be very costly, need not interfere with our quality of life, even though it's frightening to think if we had to do it within 6 months or a year, it'd be extremely difficult. But if we spread it out over time, it really won't be that bad.
There is some confusion when it comes to how climate change can be tackled, and a lot of it is political. There are some who say that mitigation measures will lead to slow economic growth. There are others who say that new green technologies offers enormous opportunities for economic growth. What do you see?
Yeah.
How does one resolve that?
Yeah, this is easy to clarify if we think about separating two things, separating them in time. So imagine that we announced now that we're going to have very heavy taxes on emissions of carbon in the future. Perhaps a steadily increasing tax, which becomes very high in 10 or 15 years. That tax won't slow economic growth now, but it will create incentives for people to start investing to find ways to avoid the tax in the future. So the expected future tax will lead to investment and the kind of change that we want. Eventually, when the tax is imposed, it may not impose much of a burden because we will have shifted a long way away from relying on carbon. So I think the fears about the slowdown are exaggerated, and we can push those, to the extent that they even materialize, push those off into the future and get the investment going right now.
There was a report from the Swiss insurance company, Swiss Re, a few months ago, and it's a report that got a lot of attention at the time. It said that climate change could cut the world's economic output by as much as $23 trillion by 2050. I mean, is that what we're potentially looking at?
You know, these kinds of numbers are sort of designed to get headlines, but they come from taking something like worldwide output, which is a big number, and then taking a small percentage off each year, and then summing it up over the next 25, 30 years. So I don't think they're very helpful. The way to think about it is that we can all see the weather changing. We can see the fires. We see the changes that we don't want. And what we don't see is the cost, but the cost will not be that high if governments just create incentives for people to make some investments, discover some new technologies, find new, better ways to power our economies.
Now, we have the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Add to that, of course, the challenges posed by climate change. How much will that affect developing countries especially?
Well, the developing countries have fewer resources, less income per person to deal with any problem. So the pandemic and climate change will be harder for them to address. This is part of why most people think that the burden for addressing climate change should fall mainly on the middle and upper income countries. To a certain extent, we've created this problem, so we should be in the forefront in solving it. And we should also do what we can to try and help deal with COVID around the world. For example, by donating vaccines or helping on the logistics of delivering vaccines. The costs of those kinds of measures are pretty small compared to the value of worldwide GDP or the GDP of the major economies.
How do middle income and upper income countries help developing countries with combating and mitigating the effects of climate change?
The best thing every country can do right now is try and encourage technological change. If we had to stop emitting carbon with existing technologies, we would have to go through a very sharp reduction in our use of energy, and that would reduce our quality of lives. But if we can innovate and come up with newer kinds of energy systems that are not as carbon intensive, we get the benefits of protecting the environment and the benefits of energy that lets us do what we want. We've seen this already, for example, in the very sharp declines in the price of photovoltaics for generating electricity from sun. We've seen it in a fall in the price of generating electricity from wind. The biggest problem that remains to be solved is storage, so that when those intermittent sources of electricity aren't available, we can call on our storage reserves. So if every country creates incentives for the innovation that will give us the better solutions, we'll all be ahead.
What kind of impact will climate change have on a growing world population? There are projections which show that the world population will grow to about 10 billion by 2050. If that does happen, what will a continuation of the climate crisis have on things like food production?
Yeah. You know, humans have been incredibly clever at finding ways of dealing with constraints that we've faced in the past. If we didn't have enough land, we found ways to use new kinds of land, to use existing land more intensively. We've had forecasts over and over again saying we were on the verge of wide-scale famine, and they've never materialized because people have been clever enough to find ways to work around the constraints. So if we just look at that historical pattern and use it to give us confidence that we can meet the demand for food from 10 billion people, that we can find ways to use energy without changing the climate. If we just have that confidence and set about doing the innovation, finding the solutions, everything will be fine.
That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Mike Wilder in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.